if the other side is right and it started at the lab, it really was a hell of a coincidence that it showed up at the seafood market first.
I can't prove that it didn't come from the lab, because it's still possible that it went immediately from the lab across town to the market and nowhere else, and then blew up. And then it probably did that twice, because there's two lineages that were both associated with the market. But that's like the only lab leak that's possible. There's these other theories that it's everywhere and we only noticed it at the market, and those don't hold up mathematically.
The argument is not just that it was a lab leak, but that it was a lab leak of a genetically engineered virus. That argument is basically that, for starters, some people from the beginning looked at this thing called a furin cleavage site in the virus and said it looked suspicious, like a product of genetic engineering. David Baltimore, famous molecular biologist, said that. And then they turned up this grant proposal. The proposal was made to DARPA, the Pentagon Research Agency. It involved Wuhan in collaboration with American researchers, I think at the University of North Carolina or somewhere. And they were specifically proposing to do something, I think, with a furin cleavage site. The grant was turned down. I'm happy to be able to commend DARPA for turning that down. But they would say that this could have well given Wuhan the idea. They could have gotten the funding elsewhere, and they just went ahead with it. That's a next big step in their argument, right?
Yeah, we divided it was an 18-hour debate across 3 days, and I anticipated there would be a lot of talk about genetics. So we split it up into like one day that was all about where and when COVID started, and that was mostly evaluating how good the evidence is that it points towards the market as the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did a whole second day on genetics, which was things like the furin cleavage site. And it's hard to have these conversations online because you just kind of jump around between all these different
points. What do you want to...
And we had a third day, which is kind of wrapping it up and putting probabilities on everything.
Yeah. It was I found it very engrossing, the debate.
So when I was first studying this, because I was 50-50 on this question for a long time, the way I answer things instead of the Bayesian method is I just kind of gather as much evidence as I can in one place. And then I try to answer questions. Like I tried to build a timeline for when it started. I tried to figure out where it started, who's patient zero. And then I did kind of a separate process for the genetics, like how important is this cleavage site? And so the where and when was one of the more convincing parts. Because on the natural origin side, there's this clean theory saying it started in maybe late November at the Huanan market. And I couldn't really find any evidence to contradict that. And on the lab leak side, I found that no one could actually agree when COVID started. I was expecting you to have some theory like, oh, it's October, this guy got sick, it spread for a month, then it hit the market. But you actually had people saying, maybe it started in September, maybe it started in November. They'd point at different things. There's this database that went offline on September 12th at the lab, like a database of the viruses they had.
Yeah, what is the story on that? What is your reply to that? Because that's gotten a lot of press that the lab suspiciously took offline a database that had all their whole warehouse of viruses on it or something.
I think it was more like a Excel spreadsheet of like collection dates and stuff. I'm not sure the exact details. There's a monitoring site that says when that was accessible, and it was like accessible in July, then not in August, then yes in September, then it stopped, then it was accessible again. So it really looks more like it's just intermittent access and they have a bad sysadmin or something like that. And it wasn't permanently offline until after the pandemic started, something like February 2020. But my point is that even if that was important, it doesn't fit the timeline of the other people's theories, because you've also got like this Wall Street Journal article saying, 3 people got sick at the lab in November. And if the lab accident was September 12th, then those 3 people in November can't possibly be patient zero. And if those 3 people are patient zero in November, then this database going offline 2 months earlier can't possibly be important. So it is that inconsistency that was one of the first red flags for me. And it gets even worse than that. It's not even just like one lab leak theorist says it's September and one gives another month, it's like even the same person will give it an extremely wide range. Like Richard E. Wright got in front of Congress and said he thinks the pandemic started sometime between July and November. And that might sound reasonable, but we know how fast this virus grows. It's within like 2 months from one patient in a city, you have like the hospitals getting overwhelmed in that city. We've seen that happen in around the world, in Italy and New York. So it doubles, the number of cases doubles about every 4 days. It doubles maybe twice a week. In a month, that's like 256 times as many cases. In 2 months, that's 60,000 times as many cases. In 3 months, you're talking like 10 million times as many. So when this guy gives a range from July to November, he's really saying at the end of November, it's either one person in Wuhan that's sick or it's 10 million people in Wuhan that are sick. And if he said it that way, you'd think this guy doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. Like he has no specific theory.
Yeah. And this guy is not SAR, right? I mean, the person you're talking to now, or did SAR subscribe to that?
No, Ebright's a professor, though. You'd think he's a professor at Rutgers. You'd think he'd have, a theory of how the lab leak happened, not just, oh, it was sometime in 2019.
Yeah. And more,
you'd think he'd have a mathematical theory, not just some vague guess like that.
And related to this is you made, I think, kind of a more general argument that, it goes back to the question of like, well, what are the chances that the infected person went straight to Wuhan? Straight to the fish market, the seafood market, and they reply, well, maybe there were infections in various places. This was the first one that caught our attention because it naturally amplified faster there. You did some math on the rate of transmission and, contagion, even in relatively ordinary circumstances, I guess, where you get 2 doublings every week of cases. And you make the argument that, look, if many other places than the seafood market had seen infections, they would have hit the radar screen in a way that none of them did, right?
Yeah. It's, if you can draw this clean exponential curve from like one case at the market in November right up until Wuhan locks down. It's January 23rd of the next year. And it's the same growth rate. And, that's a simple theory. Now, if you had, say, 10 times as many cases at the market, like it's all over Wuhan, but they only noticed it at the market, then the outbreak should also be larger in January when the city locks down. So we know roughly how many people died in Wuhan, and then you can work backwards from that, and that'll give you the time that it started.
So you're arguing that math shows that if they're right, if the other side is right, and it started at the lab, it really was a hell of a coincidence that it showed up at the seafood market first.
I can't prove that it didn't come from the lab, because it's still possible that it went immediately from the lab across town to the market and nowhere else, and then blew up. And then it probably did that twice because there's 2 lineages that were both associated with the market. But that's like the only lab leak that's possible. There's these other theories that it's everywhere and we only noticed it at the market, and those don't hold up mathematically.
Okay. And on those 2 lineages, so there's lineage A, lineage B, and I gather the first kind of outbreak, well, lineage B is more recently evolved than lineage A. It seems to have evolved out of A via a couple mutations or something. And B is the first one to spread, right? And I don't think I understand how this fact is being used by the 2 sides of the debate exactly. I mean, whose life does it complicate more, yours or SARS?
It was a paradox for everyone in 2021 before we'd really worked this out. I'd say like when the Warraby and Picard papers were posted in early 2022 is when the sort of natural origin theory solidified around one argument. And before that, you knew that there were these 2 lineages in Wuhan. You knew that lineage B looked like it started earlier in time, but you also knew that lineage A had 2 mutations closer to known bat viruses. And so that there's 2 different ways you can assign the order, and they were pointing in the opposite directions. And so that led a lot of people to come up with different theories. Like the lab leak people said, well, maybe A started at the lab, got to the market, turned into B, and then spread from there. And the resolution that's most popular now is that both were in animals at the market, and B spilled over first into humans, and then A spilled over a little bit later into humans. And that's how you can have that contradiction where one started earlier, but it's also not as close to the bat viruses.